Hi everyone, and thanks for being with me for a live feed on this occasion in relation to a subject I've been thinking about for some time and had a discussion with my family actually last night and realised that there's some validity perhaps in what I wish to talk about. So I wanted to have this conversation around transparency and lies. So my take on this is that organisations fail to be transparent, fail to allow us to look at their operations in a constructive way and to consider whether or not the things that they do are appropriate, helpful, benefit the people that they're supposed to be working with. Now, we experience that right across most organisations, and we certainly experience it politically. And my primary issue is that we tend to, organisations tend to hide from the truth. They bury the truth. They don't necessarily want to be confronted by whatever is happening within their organisation at any given time. And I think one of the primary examples of that is issues around sexual assault, harassment, bullying, and things like that, I guess, particularly we see that within politics, we see that within most organisations, in fact. And the problem for me is, why is it that we tend to want to hide those particular events? What is there about us that would make us want to say, well, let's minimise it, let's not recognise for the victim what actually is happening to them, but let's try and push it to the back of the room, put it under the carpet, do whatever we can so that it doesn't become more and more obvious and something that we eventually have to deal with. Because the interesting thing is that most situations which occur whereby an organisation has to be accountable, the more you push that under the carpet, the more you ignore it, the more you ignore the victim's rights in particular, the more likely it is to come to the surface in the end, and you're going to have to deal with it. And one of the issues for me is, why is it that we do that? Why can't we simply admit that whatever is happening at that particular time, that we confront it, we admit our level of responsibility around it, we take care of the person who's been victimised by somebody else's behaviour, and put it out there in the open for all to see, hence transparency, and let's see what kind of happens. Now, my theory is that, let's face it, organisations are run by people. They're not, bricks and mortar and paperwork. They are actually people that run organisations, and that people tend to believe that we need to protect the integrity of the organisation. Now, often protecting that integrity really is about ensuring that whatever their income stream is, whatever their reputation is, that none of that is going to be damaged. Now, we know from experience that the more an organisation attempts to protect themselves from harm, the more damaging in the end it becomes. Now, granted, that may take some time for that to happen. We know from the Roman Catholic Church, for example, that the issues around child sexual abuse took many, many decades to come out, but when it did, it was extremely damaging to the church, and likewise to a whole host of other organisations. So eventually, no matter how much you attempt to hide what is happening, as did the church, eventually it will come to the fore and it will need to be dealt with at some particular point. Granted, the people that chose to bury the issue often aren't held responsible for that. Someone else has to take that responsibility later on down the track. But nevertheless, the organisation itself does become accountable. The reason why this tends to happen, I think, is that as a species, we tend to not want to take responsibility for what other people may have done, which has impacted the organisation that we're either leading or in charge of or whatever. So So we don't want to have to be able to admit that there have been people within our organisation who have acted badly. When in actual fact, it would be in everyone's best interest if if people came forward and said, this has happened, so we admit to it. This is what we're doing to rectify the situation. That I myself, as the chief executive, for example, aren't necessarily responsible for someone else's behaviour. That's fair enough to admit that because we're not. But what I can do is ensure you that the organisation has step A, B and C that we're putting in place so this doesn't happen again. Now, the primary issue for me is that we want to run away from problems. We don't like to be confronted with problems that put us and consequently our organisation at risk. The point is, though, that we need to find the space to be able to do that. In not doing it, we find that we harm so many people, that people don't find that they are receiving the appropriate treatment that they should be when they themselves are being victimised by someone within the organisation. The other way that I view this, I think, is that because I have a lot of dealings with the child protection system in particular, sometimes we know, and it's a good example for me about what we're talking about here, about transparency and accountability, because we know what the problem is. The problem, in essence, is that social workers need to practice more like social workers, and that they need to stop blaming parents for everything that happens in that parent's life. And they need to make sure that in that process they are looking after the children and taking care of what is in the children's best interest, based also on what the children want and need. So we know what the problem is. So why in that instance aren't they able to solve the problem? Like most organisations, they can see the problem but are confused, I think, about how to resolve it. So it's particularly when there's ethics and principles involved. How do I encourage everybody to act in an ethical and principled way? How do I supervise, monitor other people's behaviour without appearing that I'm micromanaging them? So we need to be able to find ways to not just identify the problem that sits within organisations, but we need chief executives and other people to take responsibility for the ethics and the principles that they espouse, and to ensure that everybody within that organisation is abiding by those principles. Because what we wind up getting is we wind up someone contravening those principles, but acting badly and hurting and harming another person. And often that happens because we're not stringent enough about those ethics and principles that we consider to be valuable, and we're not monitoring the behaviours that enact those principles and values. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this particular space. It's like if someone comes to me and says, you, Tony, have acted in a certain way and it's made me feel uncomfortable, I'd want to know what those behaviours are, and I'd want to be able to say to them, well, look, I appreciate how you're feeling, I really do. I don't want to hurt you, that's not my objective, certainly, but what I can do is I can change that behaviour. And if I act like that again, I want you to tell me so that I can do something about it. Imagine, for example, if people within organisations, particularly managers and chief executives, said exactly the same thing. I want to know what's happening within this organisation. The problem that we have is that most of them don't want to know. They're not close enough to the people at the bottom, the people doing all the hard work, in fact. They're not close enough to them to know exactly what happens. And they don't necessarily understand what the work is that people at the front line are doing either. We often have people, particularly politically, we have people who are ministers and they're in charge of an organisation, but don't have the professional skills to understand what it is that the people at the bottom are supposed to be doing. We see this particularly within child protection system, whereby the chief executives, or not even the chief executives, but the ministers, haven't the experience to understand what it is that a social worker does, for example. And they don't monitor, so they have other people, obviously, within that organisation to monitor what's happening down the bottom. Now, We know that the best managers that there are those people who don't see themselves as someone who just sits in an ivory tower and issues orders to their underlings. But we know that the best managers are those people that have got a working knowledge of what everybody does within that organisation. That doesn't mean they need to be necessarily a social worker, but it doesn't take much effort to sit down and talk to a social worker, for example, about what a social worker is supposed to be doing and the types of relationships that those social workers are supposed to have. And it doesn't take much effort to set up a structure which ensures that everybody down that line understands what the person at the so-called bottom, the person doing the real work, what they're doing and how that impacts the people that they're working with. And once we set up that sort of structure within an organisation, then the issue around transparency becomes less of an issue, because everybody within the organisation does understand those values and principles. The problem that we have is that most organisations set up a mission statement, sets up some ideals about how it is that they're supposed to be working, but don't follow through on it. The people within the organisation don't understand those values in the first place, and they don't understand how they're supposed to be enacted in relation to behaviour. But they just kind of sit there and are viewed as just a hunk of words which basically say this is what the organisation is supposed to be about, but not really knowing how those principles are put into action. And so as a result of all of that, all of the stuff I've been talking about, we wind up with organisations who just absolutely refuse to be transparent. And I think it is important for us to understand that if we want transparent organisations, and we don't want organisations to spend most of their time lying to us about the issues that occur within those organisations that diminish the value that clients and other people might have, and the expectations that people may have on the work that's supposed to be done with them, then we need to make sure that each organisation has a sense of absolute transparency, which begins with admitting that when something goes wrong with that organisation, where an allegation is made around sexual harassment, bullying, whatever it might be, that the organisation takes the person in charge of that organisation or another manager has the ability to take responsibility for whatever happens and to ensure that it will not happen again by dealing with the person who is the perpetrator of whatever those behaviours are. And, in some organisations, celebrating getting away with it is part of the deal, it seems to me. That they because they're failing to take responsibility, there's sort of a pride taken in the fact that, well, we weren't fined or we weren't sued for whatever happened, and therefore, because that didn't happen, we got away with it. I think most litigation would be avoided if people simply said, we understand what's happening for you, we apologise, the person that's responsible for this has either lost their job or whatever, but we're taking responsibility and we're ensuring that this will not happen again. And if compensation is required, compensation needs to be offered. But at the same time, no NDAs need to be signed. We're being honest with you. We expect you to be honest with us. And we don't need to sign an agreement to say that you're never to talk about this again. Talk about it. The problem that we have here is that we fail on many, many occasions to get this stuff out there so that people can understand what's happening. And how good would it be for an organisation to be recognised as an organisation that takes responsibility for whatever happens in that organisation, and they have a way of doing it? I reckon that is the best PR program that anybody could want. So they're my thoughts on transparency and lies. Let us know when you're watching this what you think down below. If you've got any further ideas, I'd be more than delighted to hear them. So thanks for being with me, everybody. Take care of yourself and be safe.